What would you do if love arrived dressed as a lie? Jonathan Hale had everything a fortune built on skyscrapers, a penthouse high above Boston, and a reputation as cold as the steel he traded in. But his grandmother demanded one thing money couldn't buy a wife. And so began a contract, a deal with his secretary Clara Benson, a woman who carried the weight of her brother's fragile health and a lifetime of sacrifice. For 11 months, they played a part. Smiles at dinners, staged embraces, the illusion of a perfect engagement. But what happens when the illusion begins to feel real, when the man who thought he owned the world discovers he cannot control his own heart? And what happens when society, hungry for scandal, decides to tear it all apart? This is not just a love story. It is a story about pride and humility, wealth and sacrifice, about learning that the richest life is not measured in dollars, but in the people we hold close. So, will Jonathan and Clara's contract end in heartbreak, or in the kind of love that can rewrite a lifetime? If this story stirs your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. The city of Boston woke slowly that morning, the pale autumn light slipping between glass towers, washing over the quiet streets below. From the 35th floor of the Hale penthouse, the world felt distant, like a painting behind glass. Jonathan Hale stood in front of the wide windows, one hand resting in the pocket of his tailored suit, the other holding a porcelain cup of black coffee he hadn't yet touched. On his wrist gleamed a Swiss watch, its hands moving with quiet precision. Jonathan's gaze was fixed on the dial, not because he was late for a meeting, but because every tick brought him closer to the expiration of a contract that had defined the last year of his life. 24 hours. After that, the absurd arrangement with Clara Benson would be over, and his grandmother's ultimatum would hang in the balance. Jonathan was 35 years old, a self-made millionaire with a portfolio of properties scattered from the North End to the Back Bay. The newspapers called him brilliant. His competitors called him ruthless. But none of them really knew him, not the way his grandmother did. Agnes Hale, formidable matriarch of the Hale fortune, had built her own empire before Jonathan was even born. And when she grew older, she made sure her grandson understood the stakes he would inherit control of the family trust, only if he could prove he wasn't destined to die alone in a penthouse, surrounded by money but empty of love. Her solution had been brutal in its simplicity: marriage before 36. Or the empire would pass into charitable foundations. Jonathan had never believed she meant it, until the papers were drawn up, until the lawyers nodded, until the contract was signed. And so, a year ago, Jonathan had found himself standing in the office of Clara Benson, his personal secretary of 5 years, asking her for the most unprofessional favor imaginable: pretend to be his fiancée for 12 months. A performance, appear at dinners, smile for photographs, wear a ring that meant nothing. And to his surprise, she had said yes. Now, on this final morning, the weight of that decision pressed against him like the autumn wind rattling the glass. Behind him, the sound of soft footsteps echoed across the polished oak floors. Jonathan didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He knew the rhythm of her walk, steady but unhurried, practical shoes clicking against the wood. Mr. Hale. Clara's voice was calm, polite, the same voice she had used to announce board meetings and organize his calendar for years. The morning briefings are ready on your desk. Jonathan turned slightly, enough to take her in. Clara Benson, 30 years old. She was dressed, as always, in muted tones, a navy skirt, a cream blouse, a blazer that looked more practical than stylish. Her brown hair was pulled into its usual low bun, not a strand out of place. She carried a leather folder, worn at the corners, the kind of detail Jonathan noticed but never mentioned. For 11 months she had played the role of his fiancée with such quiet competence that sometimes he almost forgot it was all a charade. She smiled at his colleagues when required, stood by his side during endless cocktail parties, and endured the weight of Boston's elite staring at her as though she were an interloper. Through it all, she remained composed, professional, and infuriatingly distant. Jonathan set his coffee down. Thank you, Clara, His voice was cool, detached, the same tone he used with investors. She placed the folder on the marble counter, her eyes flicking briefly to his watch. "Only one day left," she said softly, almost to herself. The words hung in the air. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, counting down. "Are you?" Clara's lips pressed together in the faintest smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "A year is a long time to play pretend, Mr. Hale." He should have brushed it off, reminded her of the generous sum waiting in her bank account once the contract ended. But instead, something in her voice unsettled him. Perhaps it was the note of exhaustion, or the way her hands lingered on the folder as though steadying herself. Jonathan looked away, back to the window. "Then tomorrow you'll be free of it." "Yes," she said simply. And then, after a pause, "And so will you." Silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Jonathan prided himself on control of markets, of negotiations, of his own emotions. Yet, in that moment, watching the reflection of Clara's slim figure in the glass, he felt an unfamiliar unease. For a year she had been his shield against his grandmother's demands, his companion at functions he despised, his partner in a performance neither of them had chosen freely. And tomorrow, she would walk away. The thought should have relieved him. Instead, it lodged like a stone in his chest. He turned back toward her, studying the face he had grown so accustomed to, the steady eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the quiet dignity that never wavered even when others whispered about her behind crystal glasses. She was not beautiful in the polished, camera-ready way of Boston socialites. She was something harder to define, something he had never allowed himself to name. Jonathan cleared his throat. "That will be all? Clara?" She nodded, gathering herself quickly. "Of course." And with that, she left the room, the sound of her footsteps fading until only the ticking of his watch remained. Jonathan exhaled slowly. 24 hours. Just one more day. He told himself it was almost over, but as he looked out across the city, the truth whispered back to him. Unsettling and unrelenting, he wasn't sure he wanted it to be. The dining room of the Hale penthouse was a place designed for photographs. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the chandelier, its surface polished to a mirror finish. White china with gold trim sat neatly arranged at one end, beside crystal glasses that caught the morning light. A silver coffee service steamed quietly near the centerpiece of fresh orchids. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, a folded copy of the Boston Globe spread before him. His breakfast was a perfectly plated omelet, prepared by the private chef who had arrived at dawn. 2 slices of buttered toast rested on the side, untouched. Across from him, Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had declined the chef's offer and instead sipped from a simple mug of tea she had brewed herself, her leather handbag resting at her feet. The bag was the same one she had carried for years, scuffed at the corners, the strap worn smooth. Jonathan had once offered to replace it with something more fitting for her role in society, perhaps a sleek Italian design. She had refused with a polite firmness that left no room for discussion. It was that same bag, now leaning against the chair leg, that caught Jonathan's eye as he buttered his toast. He felt a flicker of irritation, not because of the bag itself, but because of what it represented: Clara's stubborn refusal to accept the world he had built around her. "Did you sleep well?" Jonathan asked at last, his tone courteous but cool. Clara looked up, surprised by the question. "Well enough," she said softly. She reached for her tea, cradling the mug with both hands. The steam curled around her face, blurring the edges for a moment. Jonathan smoothed the front of his silk tie, the deep navy catching the light. He had chosen it deliberately, as he did everything from the cut of his suits to the art on the walls. Presentation mattered. Control mattered. Clara noticed the gesture. "Of course," she always did. "You'll be late for your meeting if you keep reading the paper," she remarked, her voice gently practical. Jonathan folded the newspaper, setting it aside with measured precision. "I'm aware." A silent stretch between them, filled with the faint hum of the city below. From this height, the sounds of Boston horns, footsteps, the chatter of morning commuters faded into something abstract, almost unreal. Clara broke the quiet first. "It's strange," she said, her gaze dropping to the orchids, "to sit here every morning. In all of this," she gestured faintly at the room, "and no, it isn't really mine." Jonathan studied her across the table. Her words were spoken matter-of-factly, without bitterness, yet they unsettled him. It was never meant to be permanent, he reminded her. Clara nodded. "I know." But the way she said it, calm, resigned, tightened something in his chest. He reached for his coffee, but the taste was bitter this morning. Or perhaps it was simply his mood. Clara set her mug down carefully, as though bracing herself. "You once told me that everything in this world has a price, that if you want something badly enough, you simply pay for it." Jonathan leaned back slightly, arching a brow. "And you disagree, I think," she said slowly. "Some things can't be bought, not with money, not with power, and pretending otherwise doesn't make it true." Her eyes met his then, steady and unflinching. Jonathan held the gaze for a beat longer than he intended before looking away. The conversation ended there, but the words lingered, echoing in the space between them as the chef reappeared to clear the plates. Clara murmured a polite thank you. Jonathan gave a curt nod. When they were alone again, Jonathan stood, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "We have a dinner tonight," he reminded her. 8 o'clock, wear something appropriate." Clara's mouth twitched, almost a smile. As always, she rose from her chair, reaching down to lift her bag. The strap slid over her shoulder with familiar ease. And for a moment, Jonathan envied that ease, the way she seemed grounded in her world, even here, among things that did not belong to her. As she turned to leave, Jonathan spoke again, softer this time. "Clara." She paused. "Yes." He hesitated. There were a dozen things he could have said, criticisms, instructions, reminders. Instead, he asked, "Do you regret it? This year?" Her expression flickered, but she masked it quickly. "Regret isn't useful," she said quietly. "It doesn't change the outcome." And with that, she left the dining room, her footsteps fading into the echoing silence. Jonathan remained standing, staring at the untouched toast on his plate. For a man who had mastered every negotiation, every deal, every acquisition, it was a strange thing to feel as though he had lost some unspoken battle. The orchids swayed gently in the draft from the air vent, their petals impossibly fragile. Jonathan reached out, brushing one with the tip of his finger, and felt it tremble under his touch. For a man who had everything, he thought. Why did the room feel so unbearably empty the moment she walked out? The call came just after 9 in the morning. Clara had slipped into her office down the hall from Jonathan's, her desk already stacked with briefing folders and a half-empty cup of tea. She kept her phone on silent, as she always did during work hours. But when she saw the screen light up with Ethan's name, her heart lurched. She answered immediately. "Ethan, what's wrong?" But it wasn't his voice. It was a stranger, brisk and professional, a nurse. Clara's stomach clenched as she listened, pen frozen above her notepad. Ethan, her 20-year-old brother, had been rushed to Massachusetts General Hospital after an accident at the machine shop where he worked part-time. His hand had been caught in a press, bones shattered, tendons torn. He was conscious, but in shock. Surgery was urgent. The words blurred together. Emergency, risk of permanent damage, insurance complications. Clara gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I'll be there," she whispered. "Please, just take care of him." When the call ended, the room seemed unbearably quiet. Clara pressed her hands to her face, forcing herself to breathe. She had always been the strong one. Since their parents died in a car accident nearly a decade ago, she had raised Ethan like her own child, worked late shifts, skipped meals, taken on every burden without complaint. He was supposed to be the hopeful one, the dreamer who could still imagine a different future. And now, this. She stood abruptly, shoving files into her bag, her mind racing. She had to leave, had to get to the hospital. But there was still Jonathan's schedule, still the contract, still appearances to maintain. Her chest tightened with panic. The sound of a door opening made her freeze. Jonathan Hale stepped into the office, tall and immaculate, his presence filling the space. His eyes flicked from her pale face to the papers scattered across her desk. What's happened? Clara swallowed hard, straightening instinctively. Something's come up. I need to step out for a while. Jonathan's gaze narrowed. Be specific. Her hands trembled as she clutched the strap of her worn handbag. It's my brother, Ethan. There was an accident at his job. They've taken him into surgery for a heartbeat. Jonathan said nothing. His expression remained carefully neutral, the practiced mask of a man who dealt daily with crises worth millions. Yet something shifted in his eyes, something Clara hadn't seen before. Concern. Is it serious? He asked quietly. Her throat tightened. They said if he doesn't get the right surgery, he could lose full use of his hand. But the insurance. She broke off, unable to finish. Jonathan took a step closer. How much? Clara blinked at him. What? The surgery? How much will it cost? She shook her head quickly. I didn't tell you this so you could, Mr. Hale, the contract is clear. You can't give me money outside the agreed payment. That was the rule. His jaw tightened. I don't care about the contract. The words stunned her. For nearly a year he had treated that document like scripture, binding them both in roles neither wanted. To hear him dismiss it so easily now sent a shock through her. Clara forced herself to steady her voice. It's not just about the contract. I don't want your charity. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his patience fraying. Clara, this isn't charity. It's necessity. Tell me the number. Her eyes filled despite her best effort. 50,000, she whispered. That's what the nurse said. Maybe more, depending on complications. Without another word, Jonathan strode to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a checkbook. He sat, pen scratching swiftly across paper. Jonathan? Don't argue with me. His tone was firm, but not cruel, more like a man refusing to watch disaster unfold. He tore the check free and held it out. 100,000. Use the rest for follow-up care. And don't refuse it. Not this time. Clara stared at the slip of paper as if it were a live wire. I can't. You can, Jonathan insisted, his voice lower now, steady. And you will, because if you walk into that hospital without resources, and your brother suffers for it, you'll never forgive yourself, and neither will I. Her hand shook as she reached for the check, but she stopped short, pulling back as though burned. Why are you doing this? Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. He could have said it was strategy, that he needed her composed for tonight's dinner, that appearances mattered, but for once, he didn't hide behind excuses. Because I know what it's like, he said quietly. Clara frowned. What do you mean? His gaze drifted, not to the window this time, but inward, toward something long buried. My father, he said slowly. He died when I was 19. A heart condition. The surgery could have saved him, but the insurance dragged its feet. By the time they approved, it was too late. The admission hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Jonathan Hale never spoke of his past. Yet, here it was, laid bare between them. Clara's breath caught. For the first time, she saw not the untouchable millionaire, but a man who had known loss, who carried scars invisible to the world. She lowered her gaze, tears threatening. With trembling hands, she finally took the check. Thank you, she whispered. Jonathan nodded once, curtly, as though sealing a business deal. But inside, something shifted, quiet and undeniable. For the first time in 11 months, the contract between them felt like more than ink and obligation. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to name. Clara stood frozen, the pale slip of paper still in Jonathan's hand, as though the mere act of taking it would bind her to something she couldn't undo. Jonathan, I can't accept this, she said firmly, though her voice trembled. It's not just the contract. She struggled to find the words. It's dignity. If I take this, I'll never know if it was because you cared or because you pitied me. Jonathan's eyes darkened. Clara, Your brother doesn't need your pride. He needs that surgery. Her breath came unevenly. Don't you think I've done this math? For years I've worked every job I could, saved every penny, skipped meals, all so Ethan could have a chance at something better. And now, in the last 24 hours of this contract, you want me to believe you suddenly care enough to hand me. She glanced at the number on the check, her eyes widening. Twice the amount I asked for. Jonathan did not flinch. Yes. Why? The single word broke from her lips, sharp as glass. Why now? For a long moment he didn't answer. He only set the check gently on the desk between them, as if placing it there might lessen the weight of it. He turned away, staring out at the city skyline, his reflection caught in the glass. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. Because I know what it feels like to sit in a hospital room and watch someone you love slip away while all the systems that should save them move too slowly. Because money sat in the wrong account, waiting on approval. Because paperwork mattered more than a life. Clara's breath caught. She had heard whispers of Jonathan's past, rumors of a father who died young, a family fractured but never from his own lips. He turned back to her, his expression raw in a way she had never seen. I was 19. My father's heart condition had been diagnosed a year earlier. The doctors said the surgery was urgent, but the insurance dragged it out. Appeals, denials, forms that went missing. He collapsed in our kitchen one night. By the time they wheeled him into surgery, his body had given up. The silence stretched, heavy with grief that still clung after all these years. Jonathan's jaw tightened, the only sign of the storm beneath his calm exterior. I swore that day, he said, that if money could ever prevent that kind of loss again, I would never hesitate, not for myself, not for anyone I cared about. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. For 11 months she had thought of Jonathan as stone impenetrable, calculated, incapable of kindness beyond strategic appearances. Now she saw the cracks, the wound that had shaped the man he had become. But even as her heart softened, her fear remained. And what happens after tomorrow, she whispered, when the contract ends, when we go our separate ways? What will this money mean? Then, another business expense written off another line item in your ledger. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice steady but low. It will mean your brother has a chance. That's all that matters. Her lips parted, but no protest came. She looked down at the check again, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The paper felt weightless and impossibly heavy all at once. I don't want to owe you, she murmured. You don't, Jonathan said, not in any way that matters. She pressed the check to her chest, closing her eyes for a moment as though absorbing its reality. Then she opened them, meeting his gaze. Thank you. The words were small, but sincere. Jonathan gave a single nod, his face unreadable once more. Yet beneath that mask, his chest tightened with something he refused to name. When Clara left the room, Jonathan remained by the window, the city sprawling beneath him. He thought of his father, the sound of his laughter, the smell of coffee in the mornings, the way he had once believed that hard work could protect his family. He thought of the moment that belief shattered, and now he thought of Clara, her worn handbag, her tired eyes, her unyielding pride, the way she carried burdens no one her age should have to carry, the way she had endured 11 months of his indifference and cruelty, and still managed to hold herself with dignity. Jonathan pressed a hand against the cool glass of the window. For years he had told himself that money was armor, that wealth could buy distance from pain, from loss. But standing here, watching Clara walk out with that check in her hands, he realized money was only as powerful as the heart that guided it. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if his heart was finally learning how to guide anything at all. The invitation arrived embossed in silver, tucked neatly inside a cream envelope. Jonathan had known it was coming. Margaret Whitmore never missed an opportunity to host one of her grand soirees. Her parties were famous across Boston, lavish affairs where fortunes were flaunted, secrets exchanged like currency, and reputations polished or destroyed with a single remark. Margaret herself, wife of shipping magnate Charles Whitmore, was more feared than admired. Her talent for detecting weakness was unmatched. She could spot a counterfeit smile across a ballroom and dismantle it with a single cutting phrase. Jonathan had avoided her gatherings whenever possible, but tonight was different. Tonight, the last night before the contract expired, attendance was unavoidable. The Whitmores were tied to a land acquisition worth billions, and a missed appearance could jeopardize negotiations. He sat at his desk that morning, the silver-edged card resting before him like a summons. Clara stood across the room, reviewing the evening schedule with practiced calm. "You'll need to be there by 7, she said, her eyes on the paper in her hands. Black tie, dinner first, then dancing. There will be press coverage." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes betraying the long night she had spent at the hospital with Ethan. Still, her voice remained steady, her posture straight. "The perfect professional, Clara," he said quietly. She looked up. "Are you sure you're up for this?" She hesitated. "It's part of the job, isn't it?" His jaw tightened. He wanted to say no, to tell her she didn't have to endure one more performance for the sake of his empire. But the truth was more complicated. Margaret Whitmore had already been circling like a hawk, whispering suspicions into eager ears. If Clara wasn't there, if even the smallest detail seemed off, Margaret would pounce. Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck. Margaret will be watching. Clara's expression flickered. She always is. As if summoned by her name, the phone on Jonathan's desk buzzed. He answered, his grandmother's attorney on the other end. The voice was low, measured, but carried a warning. "Mr. Hale, I thought you should know Margaret Whitmore has been asking questions. About the contract, about Clara. I don't know how much she's uncovered, but she seems intent on proving the engagement isn't what it appears." Jonathan's grip on the receiver tightened. "And how exactly do you know this?" "She's not subtle," the attorney replied dryly. "Half of Beacon Hill has heard her dropping hints." Jonathan hung up slowly, his mind already racing. When he looked at Clara, she was watching him carefully. "She knows? Doesn't she? Maybe not everything," he admitted, "but enough to make tonight dangerous." Clara crossed her arms, the gesture defensive. "Then, perhaps, it's best if I don't go." Jonathan shook his head instantly. "If you don't show, it's confirmation. Margaret thrives on absences, on silences. She'll spin it into a scandal before dessert is served." Clara lowered her gaze. "And if I do show, if she exposes us in front of everyone," Jonathan stood, moving around the desk until he was close enough to see the tension in her shoulders. "Then we face it together." The words hung between them, heavier than he intended. Together. For nearly a year he had treated her as an accessory, a necessary inconvenience. But tonight, the word carried weight. A promise that even he wasn't sure he could fully explain. Clara exhaled slowly. "I'll be ready." That evening, the Hale limousine rolled up the long drive of the Whitmore estate. The mansion stood illuminated against the darkening sky, its windows blazing with golden light. Guests in gowns and tuxedos spilled across the steps, laughter and conversation mingling with the strains of a string quartet. Inside, the ballroom glittered with chandeliers, every surface polished to a sheen. Waiters glided between guests with trays of champagne, the air heavy with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. Jonathan entered with Clara on his arm. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, modest but elegant. Her hair swept into soft waves. The contrast between her and the jeweled women around her was stark, but somehow she drew more eyes than any of them. Jonathan felt the shift in the room, the way conversations paused, the way gazes lingered. And then, from across the room, Margaret Whitmore appeared. She was draped in silver silk, diamonds glittering at her throat. Her smile was sharp, her eyes calculating. As she approached, Jonathan felt Clara's grip on his arm tighten ever so slightly. "Jonathan Hale," Margaret purred, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "And the lovely Clara." How delightful that you could join us. Margaret, Jonathan replied evenly. Thank you for the invitation. Her gaze slid to Clara, lingering with a predator's patience. My dear, you look radiant, almost convincing. Clara's chin lifted, her eyes meeting Margaret's without flinching. Almost Margaret's smile widened, pleased by the reaction. I've always admired good performances. I do hope you'll be able to maintain yours this evening. It would be such a shame if cracks began to show. With that, she drifted away, leaving the sting of her words behind like perfume. Clara's hand tightened again on Jonathan's arm. She's going to do it, she whispered. She's going to expose us. Jonathan's jaw set, the steel in his eyes unmistakable. Let her try. But deep inside, beneath the confidence, he knew the truth. Margaret Whitmore never entered a fight she wasn't certain she could win. Hospitals had always unsettled Jonathan. Too many memories clung to the walls, sterile corridors that smelled faintly of bleach and despair. Rooms where time seemed suspended, where monitors beeped and whispered of fragile hope. He had avoided them whenever he could, sending assistants or attorneys when business required his presence. But tonight, as the limousine rolled past Massachusetts General's entrance, he gave the driver a simple order: wait. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their glow unforgiving. Jonathan moved past the crowded waiting area, ignoring the curious glances. His tailored suit looked out of place among the flannel shirts and worn jackets of people clutching styrofoam cups of coffee, their faces lined with exhaustion. He spotted Clara almost instantly. She sat in a plastic chair near the end of the hall, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her hair, usually pulled back neatly, had loosened into soft strands that framed her pale face. The emerald gown she'd worn to the Whitmore's dinner had been traded for jeans and a cardigan, wrinkled from hours of waiting. She didn't notice him at first. She was staring at the floor, her body leaning forward as though bracing against an invisible weight. Beside her chair sat her old leather handbag, scuffed and worn, loyal as always. Jonathan approached quietly, carrying a paper bag from a nearby diner. He had never set foot in one before tonight, but something told him she needed more than catered delicacies and crystal glasses. She needed something ordinary, something warm. Clara. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. Jonathan? What are you? I asked your nurse where to find you. He set the bag on the small table beside her. You haven't eaten all day. She blinked at the bag, then back at him, as though struggling to reconcile the image of Jonathan Hale, real estate mogul, with Jonathan Hale, man delivering takeout at midnight. I'm not hungry, she murmured. Neither was I, he admitted. But I forced myself anyway. Eat something. When she didn't move, he opened the bag himself, pulling out a container of chicken noodle soup and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The smell filled the sterile corridor, startling in its homeliness. He placed the soup in her hands, his touch lingering just long enough to steady her trembling fingers. Clara stared at him, still bewildered. Why are you here? Jonathan settled into the chair beside her, loosening his tie. Because your brother matters to you, and that means he matters to me. She shook her head, eyes glassy. That's not part of the contract. No. He agreed softly. It's not. For a long time, they sat in silence, broken only by the distant sounds of hospital life nurses' footsteps, muffled announcements, the occasional wail of grief or relief from other families. Clara lifted the spoon to her lips mechanically, as though her body obeyed before her mind could catch up. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. He studied the sterile tile floor, the flickering light overhead. I haven't set foot in this place since my father died, he said quietly. Clara's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. She turned to him, startled. He collapsed in our kitchen, Jonathan continued, his voice low. By the time the ambulance brought him here, they were already saying words like critical and delayed authorization. I remember sitting in a chair like this one, my mother clutching her rosary, Me staring at the floor, thinking money would solve everything. But it didn't. Not then. Clara set the soup aside, her eyes never leaving his face. He rarely spoke of his past, but tonight, in the harsh light of the hospital, the walls seemed thinner. I hated this place, Jonathan admitted. The smell, the waiting, the way strangers cried in corners while the rest of the world kept turning. I told myself I would never let that kind of helplessness touch me again, that I would build walls so high no loss could climb them. He gave a short, bitter laugh. And I did. Until you... Clara's breath caught. Jonathan. He turned, meeting her gaze directly. I don't know when it happened. Maybe the night you stood at that gala with everyone whispering and still held your head high. Maybe the morning you corrected me when I misquoted Frost. Maybe just 100 little moments I pretended not to notice. But tonight, sitting here, I can't pretend anymore. The words hung heavy between them, not quite a confession, but close enough to make Clara's heart race. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady. You don't mean that, she whispered. You're tired. You're remembering things you'd rather forget. Tomorrow, this will all be over, and you'll go back to your world. And I'm already in it, Jonathan cut in, his tone sharper than he intended, then softer. Your world. Whether you want me there or not. Clara looked away, tears blurring the sterile white walls. For the first time since this arrangement began, she felt the ground shift beneath her. Jonathan was not speaking like her employer, not even like her fiancé for hire. For one impossible moment, he was just a man sitting beside her, stripped of power, offering the only thing he had left, himself. The beep of monitors from Ethan's room interrupted the silence. Clara rose quickly, setting the soup aside. I should check on him. Jonathan stood too. I'll wait. She hesitated, her hand on the doorframe. Why? He gave a small, weary smile. Because no one should sit in a hospital alone. For once, Clara didn't argue. She only nodded and disappeared into her brother's room, leaving Jonathan in the harsh light of the corridor, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. The hallway outside Ethan's room had grown quiet. Visiting hours were nearly over, the families thinning out, leaving only the faint hum of machines and the occasional squeak of a janitor's cart. Jonathan sat in the hard plastic chair, jacket folded neatly beside him, the fluorescent light casting tired shadows across his face. When the door opened, Clara stepped out, her shoulders slumped, her cardigan slipping slightly off one arm. She looked drained, but calmer. He's asleep, she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of relief only exhaustion could temper. Jonathan rose, smoothing his tie out of habit. That's good. She nodded, crossing her arms against the chill of the corridor. For a moment, they stood in silence, bound by the fragile peace of the hospital's night. Then Jonathan cleared his throat, the sound rougher than he intended. Clara, I need to say something. She glanced at him warily. What now? He took a step closer, careful but deliberate. I care about you. Her brow furrowed. Don't. I mean it. He pressed. Not the performance, not the contract. You, the way you carry yourself, the way you fight for your brother, the way you've endured 11 months of my arrogance without once lowering yourself. I've been cruel to you because... His voice faltered, but he pushed on. Because you matter to me more than I wanted to admit. Clara stared at him as though he'd spoken in another language. Then she laughed a short, incredulous sound. Do you hear yourself? 11 months, Jonathan. 11 months of insults, of being treated like I was beneath you, and now, with 1 day left, you expect me to believe this sudden revelation. Jonathan flinched at her words, but didn't look away. I was wrong. Her anger flared, sharp enough to burn away the weariness in her eyes. Wrong. You humiliated me in front of your friends, mocked my clothes, made me sit through dinners while you ignored me like I was furniture. Do you know how many nights I went home, wondering if I had lost the last shred of my self-respect? His throat tightened. Clara. No, she cut in, her voice trembling. You don't get to rewrite the last year just because you're feeling guilty. You don't get to stand here, in this place, with my brother fighting for his future, and pretend you've been anything other than what you are, a man who paid me to play the role of someone you could never truly love. The words struck him like blows, each one deserved. He had no defense, only the truth, fragile as glass. I hurt you, he admitted, his voice raw. I know that, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to believe me when I say I'm not pretending now. Clara shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. You don't understand. It's not just about you. It's about me. I can't afford to believe you, because if I do, and tomorrow you decide it was nothing more than guilt or loneliness, I'll be the fool who let herself fall for a lie. Her words trembled, but her posture remained defiant, arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if holding herself together against the force of his confession. Jonathan felt the weight of her mistrust pressing down, heavier than any deal he had ever risked. He wanted to argue, to list the moments he hadn't meant to show how he memorized her coffee order, how he noticed the way she hummed when she worked, how he found excuses to keep her near. But none of that would erase the months of disdain he had cloaked himself in. So instead he said softly, "You're right to doubt me. I've given you every reason." Clara blinked, startled by his admission. "But doubt doesn't erase what I feel," he continued, "and if it takes the rest of my life to prove it to you, then that's what I'll do." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes shimmered with conflict, anger warring with something she didn't want to name. She turned away, pressing her hands against the cool wall, breathing hard as if the weight of the moment was crushing her. Inside, her thoughts tangled in knots. For 11 months. She had told herself it was an arrangement, nothing more, that she could endure the humiliation for Ethan's sake, for survival. But then there had been those fleeting moments when Jonathan adjusted her chair without thinking, when he ordered her favorite dessert without asking, when his eyes softened as if he saw more than just an employee. She had buried those moments, convinced they were tricks of her imagination. And now, here he was, confessing what she had long feared and longed for in equal measure. She turned back to him, her cheeks wet with silent tears. "You don't know what you're asking of me," she whispered. "To believe you, to forgive you, to trust that the man who made me feel invisible for almost a year suddenly sees me now." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "I do see you, Clara, more clearly than I've ever seen anyone." For a heartbeat, the world held still, the humming lights, the faint beeping of monitors, the two of them caught between past wounds and uncertain hope. Then Clara shook her head, retreating a step. "I can't. Not tonight." Her voice broke on the last word, and she brushed past him, heading down the corridor toward the vending machines. Jonathan watched her go, the hollow echo of her footsteps marking the distance between them. He remained in the harsh light, alone once more. But this time, it wasn't the sterile walls of the hospital that pressed on him. It was the weight of knowing that, for the first time in his life, he wanted something money could not buy, and he might never be able to earn it. The rain began in the late afternoon, gray sheets sweeping over Boston, turning the glass towers into blurred shadows. From the penthouse, Jonathan stood before the window, his reflection superimposed over the storm outside. He had spent the morning on calls, his voice firm, his words clipped, but now he was silent. The Whitmore Gala was scheduled for that evening. Contracts worth over $1 billion hung in the balance. The land deal Jonathan had spent 2 years maneuvering would be finalized only if the Whitmores signed. And yet Margaret's smile from the night before haunted him like a blade waiting to fall. Behind him, Clara sat at the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped together. She had spent the day at the hospital, watching Ethan's condition stabilize, only to return here and find Jonathan pacing, unsettled. She had never seen him like this, not in meetings, not under pressure, not even in courtrooms where millions were at stake. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Jonathan turned, his expression sharp. "Cancel." Clara blinked. Cancel the gala. He nodded once. If Margaret wants a stage, I won't give her one. I'll send my regrets. Claim a family emergency. Let the deal wait. Clara rose quickly, alarm flashing in her eyes. Jonathan, you can't. That contract your company? I don't care, he snapped, then immediately regretted the harshness. He raked a hand through his hair, pacing. Clara, I won't put you through that. Not again. Not with her circling like a vulture. Clara stepped closer, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. You've worked your whole life for this. Built an empire with your own hands. Are you really going to throw it away because of me? Jonathan met her gaze, his jaw tight. If protecting you means losing everything, then yes. The words fell between them, heavy and irrevocable. Clara's breath caught. For months she had wondered what she meant to him. For months she had tried to bury the flickers of tenderness behind layers of skepticism. And now, here he was, saying he would sacrifice everything for her. She shook her head. Overwhelmed? You can't mean that. I do. Clara's voice broke. Jonathan, don't do this for me. I've spent my whole life fighting for scraps, for dignity, for Ethan's future. I can survive Margaret Whitmore's cruelty, but I can't survive knowing I cost you your career. He took her shoulders gently, his touch firm but trembling with restraint. Clara, you've already given more than you realize. You've endured me at my worst. You've carried yourself with strength when I tried to break it. If there's one thing I've learned this year, it's that nothing is worth more than the person standing in front of me right now. Her eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to look at him. And what happens tomorrow? When the contract ends, when all of this disappears, will you still believe that Jonathan's silence stretched, the storm outside rattling against the glass? He wanted to say yes, wanted to promise forever, but the truth lodged heavy in his throat. He had built his life on certainties, on contracts that spelled out every clause. This feeling had no blueprint. Clara stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. Jonathan, don't cancel. Don't throw away everything you've built. Not for me. I don't want to be the reason you lose it all. He stared at her, torn between the empire that had defined him and the woman who was slowly unraveling everything he thought he knew about himself. Finally, he exhaled, a sound that carried both defeat and resolve. Then we'll go. Together. Clara's lips parted, surprise flickering across her face. Even if Margaret exposes us, especially then, his voice hardened, steel beneath the quiet. If she wants a spectacle, I'll give her one. But this time, she won't see a contract. She'll see the truth. Clara searched his face, looking for cracks, for hesitation. But what she saw was something else entirely, a man willing to stand in the storm, not above it. Her throat tightened. Jonathan. He reached for her hand, his touch uncharacteristically tentative. Clara. I've spent my life negotiating, calculating, controlling outcomes. But with you, I can't control it. I can only choose, and I choose you. For a moment. The storm outside roared louder, thunder rolling over the city. Clara's heart pounded in rhythm with it, caught between disbelief and a fragile, dangerous hope. She squeezed his hand once before pulling away gently. Then, let's go face her. But promise me something. Anything. Her eyes held his, unwavering. Promise me you won't sacrifice the company, your people, your future just to shield me. I can endure Margaret. I can endure whispers. What I can't endure is watching you throw away everything you are. Jonathan swallowed hard, his gaze locked on hers. Then, slowly, he nodded, I promise. The words felt like both surrender and salvation. As Clara turned to prepare for the evening, Jonathan remained by the window, watching the storm lash against the city. He had never felt so uncertain, never stood on ground so unsteady, and yet, for the first time, he wasn't afraid of falling. The Whitmore ballroom gleamed like a jewel box. Chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble floors. Violins sang softly in the background, and crystal glasses clinked in a steady rhythm of wealth. Everywhere Jonathan looked, power was on display, women in gowns dripping with jewels, men in tuxedos laughing too loudly as deals were whispered behind champagne flutes. But, beneath the glitter, Jonathan felt the weight of unease pressing in. He could feel Clara tense beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for an escape route. And then Margaret Whitmore made her entrance. She glided down the staircase in a gown of silver satin, her diamonds catching every glint of light. The crowd parted instinctively, their smiles sharpening as they leaned in for gossip. Margaret thrived on this stage, her reputation as Boston's cruelest hostess both feared and admired. "Jonathan Hale," she announced, her voice carrying like a stage actress, "and his charming fiancée." She emphasized the last word with a smile that cut like a blade. Clara stiffened, her chin lifting, but her eyes betrayed the tremor inside. Jonathan felt it too, the shift in the room, the anticipation of a predator about to strike. The first blow came not in words, but in flashes. Cameras turned toward them. Journalists Margaret had tipped off snapping photo after photo. Microphones appeared as if conjured, questions fired rapid and sharp. "Miss Benson, how long have you been engaged? Mr. Hale, is it true your grandmother demanded this arrangement? Clara, some say you were a secretary before this. How convenient to fall in love with your billionaire boss." The laughter was quiet at first, tucked behind wine glasses and raised brows. But it spread, the cruel kind of laughter that feeds on discomfort. Someone whispered, "Gold digger," and the word rippled through the crowd like poison. Clara's face flushed. She tried to speak, but the barrage of voices drowned her out. Margaret stepped forward, her smile wide for the cameras. "It is such a touching story. Isn't it? A secretary who captures her employer's heart. But one has to wonder, was it love? Or a contract?" Gasps followed, some genuine, some delighted by the scandal. Jonathan's stomach clenched. He had expected Margaret to play games, but this was open war. Clara's eyes filled with panic. She shook her head, opening her mouth to deny it, but Margaret pressed on, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't be shy, dear. Everyone admires ambition. And what greater ambition than turning a desk job into a diamond ring?" Laughter again. Louder this time. The reporters leaned closer, pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing. Clara looked small under the weight of it, her hand trembling on Jonathan's sleeve. Something inside him snapped. Enough. The single word cut through the noise, cold and commanding. Jonathan stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Clara and the crowd. His voice, steady but burning with restrained fury, carried across the room. "You want the truth," he said, his gaze sweeping the sea of hungry eyes. "Yes, Clara Benson was my secretary. Yes, she became my fiancée under circumstances you wouldn't understand. And yes," he reached back, taking her hand firmly, "I love her. Not because of contracts, not because of appearances, but because she is the strongest, most selfless person I have ever known." The room fell into shocked silence, broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras. Jonathan turned, his eyes locking on Margaret. "And you," his voice dropped to ice, "for all your wealth and power, you've built nothing but fear. You tear people down to feel taller. But tonight, you will not touch her." Margaret's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before she recovered. "Oh, Jonathan, such a speech. But words are easy. Proof, however, proof is harder." She gestured toward the cameras. "The world can see it for themselves. 11 months of staged appearances. A sudden engagement when a fortune is at stake, hardly the portrait of true love. Tell me, Clara, how much did he pay you?" The crowd leaned forward, eager. The cruelty of the question landed like a slap, and Clara flinched, her throat tightened, words choking before they could form. Jonathan squeezed her hand, but he could feel the tremor in her body, the way the shame threatened to break her. He wanted to shout, to silence them all, but the damage was already spreading. Reporters scribbled, guests murmured, and Clara's face grew pale as the weight of their judgment pressed down. She pulled her hand free, shaking her head, her voice breaking. "I can't." The words were almost lost under the clamor, but Jonathan heard them. He reached for her, desperate, but Clara stepped back. The cameras caught at the distance between them, the doubt in her eyes, and in that instant, Jonathan felt everything he had built, everything he had tried to protect, teetering on collapse. The empire, the inheritance, and worse, the fragile, unspoken bond between him and Clara. Margaret's smile widened, triumphant. Around them, the ballroom buzzed with scandal, the cruel spotlight burning brighter with every whispered word. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hale felt powerless. And for the first time, Clara Benson felt utterly alone. The ballroom was still buzzing with scandal when a new voice cut through the noise. Jonathan, every head turned. At the top of the staircase stood Agnes Hale. Her silver hair was swept neatly into a chignon, her dark gown understated but regal. She carried herself with the poise of a woman who had weathered decades of Boston society storms and never once been moved by them. For Jonathan, the sight of her sent a jolt through his chest. His grandmother rarely appeared at public gatherings anymore, her health fragile, her presence more rumor than reality. Yet here she was, leaning on her cane, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Grandmother. Jonathan breathed. Agnes descended slowly, each step deliberate, commanding silence with nothing more than her presence. By the time she reached the floor, even Margaret Whitmore's triumphant smile had dimmed. Agnes's gaze moved from Jonathan to Clara, lingering on the young woman's pale face, then shifted to the assembled guests. "It seems," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly, "that I have arrived just in time." The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras flashing. Margaret recovered quickly, plastering on a polite smile. "Mrs. Hale, what a surprise. I didn't realize you'd be joining us tonight." "That," Agnes replied coolly, "is because you were not meant to know." Margaret's smile faltered. Agnes turned, her cane tapping once against the marble floor. "Jonathan, Clara, walk with me." The crowd parted like water as the three of them moved into a side room, the door closing behind them. The noise of the gala faded, replaced by the softer hum of silence. Jonathan faced his grandmother, tension in every line of his body. "You shouldn't have come out in this weather," he said. Agnes lifted a brow. "Weather has never stopped me before. Sit." They obeyed. Jonathan stiff in his chair, Clara perched on the edge of hers as though ready to flee at any moment. Agnes studied them both for a long moment, her gaze sharp, unrelenting. Then she spoke. "I imagine you believe your inheritance hangs in the balance tonight. That one wrong move, and you lose everything." Jonathan straightened, jaw tight. "Isn't that the truth?" A small smile tugged at Agnes's lips. "No, Jonathan, that was never the truth." Silence. Jonathan blinked, his composure cracking. "What are you saying I'm saying?" Agnes replied evenly. "That the marriage clause in my will was never legally binding. It was a test. Nothing more." Clara inhaled sharply. Jonathan stared, his mind struggling to process the words. Agnes leaned on her cane, her voice steady. "I wanted to know if you were capable of love. Real love, not deals, not contracts, not appearances to satisfy a boardroom. I wanted to see if you could care for another person more than you care for your empire." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. "You manipulated me. For a year." "I guided you," Agnes corrected. "Because, Jonathan, I raised you. I saw the boy who buried his grief beneath ambition. I saw the man who turned that ambition into stone walls so high no one could climb them. And I saw what it was doing to you." Her eyes softened just slightly. "I couldn't stand by and let you become a man incapable of love." Clara shifted uncomfortably. glancing between them. Mrs. Hale? If I had known Agnes held up a hand. Oh, my dear, I knew you didn't. That's precisely why I allowed it. I knew the truth about you from the start. 3 jobs, caring for your brother, enduring Jonathan's cruelty without asking for anything in return. Do you think I didn't know he left you waiting in restaurants, mocked your clothes, treated you as if you were less? I knew every word, every slight. And I watched to see if you would bend or break. Clara's cheeks flushed, shame and anger mingling. And what did you see? Agnes's expression softened. I saw strength. I saw a young woman who held her dignity even when it would have been easier to surrender it. And I saw my grandson, slowly, painfully, beginning to realize what a fool he had been. Jonathan swallowed hard, guilt rising like bile. So, this entire year, the inheritance, the contract, it was nothing but theater, not nothing, Agnes said firmly. You needed the lesson, and you needed Clara to teach it to you. The words hit him harder than any business loss ever had. He looked at Clara, her eyes shining with tears she fought to hide. She had borne the weight of his worst self, and now his grandmother was telling him she had been the mirror he refused to face. Jonathan's voice was low, almost a whisper. And if I had failed, Agnes regarded him with that same piercing gaze that had once reduced boardrooms to silence. Then you would still be rich, still be powerful, still be alone. The truth of it landed like a stone in his chest. Clara finally spoke, her voice trembling. So, all of this, all the humiliation, the pretending it was never necessary. Agnes shook her head gently. Necessary for money? No. Necessary for Jonathan? Yes. Because without you, he would never have learned what it means to put someone else first. The room fell silent. Jonathan pressed his hands together, his composure cracking under the weight of revelation. Clara looked away, overwhelmed, torn between vindication and despair. At last, Agnes rose, steady despite her cane. I have no interest in contracts. Jonathan, what I want to know is simple. She looked at him, then at Clara. Now that you know the truth, what will you choose, love or pride? Her question lingered in the quiet room like a verdict waiting to be rendered. The private room was quiet after Agnes left, her words still echoing like thunder long after the door closed. Jonathan sat rigid in his chair, his mind a storm of revelations. Across from him, Clara twisted her hands together, unable to meet his eyes. For a long time, neither spoke. The truth lay heavy between them. The contract had never mattered. The fortune had never been at risk. Everything had been a test of him, and perhaps of them both. Jonathan rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as though carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Clara, who finally lifted her gaze, startled by the intensity in his eyes. Clara, he began, his voice low but steady. I've made a fool of myself for nearly a year. I've hidden behind arrogance, behind contracts, behind excuses, and I nearly lost the only thing in my life that has ever felt real. She opened her mouth, but he lifted a hand gently. Please, let me finish. Reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, Jonathan pulled out a small velvet box. Clara gasped, her breath catching as he lowered himself to one knee. The world seemed to tilt. For 11 months, this entire arrangement had been performance, a stage they both endured. But now, in the stark quiet of the hospital, Jonathan Hale looked nothing like a man rehearsing lines. He looked stripped bare, his heart exposed. Clara Benson, he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Not my secretary, not my fiancée for hire, but the woman who has taught me what love truly is. I don't care about the inheritance, the empire, or the whispers of people who will never understand us. I care about you, only you, and if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you deserve. Will you marry me for real? This time Clara's eyes flooded with tears. Her lips parted, her whole body trembling with the enormity of the moment. For a heartbeat, the rest of the world disappeared. It was only him, kneeling before her, and the love she had tried so hard to deny. "Jonathan?" The sudden shriek of alarms cut her off. Both turned as the sound tore through the quiet, harsh and urgent. From down the hall, nurses rushed past, their footsteps quick, their voices urgent. A code was being called. Clara's breath caught as she realized which room the commotion centered around. "Ethan!" she whispered, bolting to her feet. Jonathan rose instantly, following her as she sprinted down the corridor. The alarms blared louder, monitors flashing red through the glass walls of the ICU. Clara pressed against the window, her hands flat against the glass as doctors surrounded her brother's bed. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," a nurse urged, blocking the door. Clara's chest heaved, panic rising like a wave. "What's happening? Please, tell me what's happening." "Respiratory failure," the nurse said quickly, before disappearing into the room. Clara's knees buckled. Jonathan caught her before she fell, his arms wrapping around her trembling body. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled by the fabric of his suit. Inside the room, the scene was chaos, doctors shouting orders. A crash cart wheeled in, Ethan's body jerking as they prepared for intervention. The steady beep of the monitor had turned into a shrill, continuous tone that chilled Clara's blood. Jonathan held her tighter, his own throat constricting. For a man who had built his life on control, this was the ultimate helplessness: to watch, to wait, unable to buy time or bargain with fate. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, one of the doctors called out, and the relentless alarm gave way to a steadier rhythm. The monitors stabilized. Ethan's chest rose and fell again, shallow but present. The team moved quickly, adjusting equipment, administering medication. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the crisis subsided, leaving behind a trembling silence. Clara pressed her forehead against the glass, her tears blurring the sight of her brother lying pale and motionless on the bed. Relief and terror warred inside her chest. Jonathan remained at her side, his arm firm around her shoulders. He didn't speak because there were no words large enough for the moment. After a long silence, Clara turned to him, her face streaked with tears. Her eyes fell to the velvet box still in his hand, the ring inside glinting faintly in the fluorescent light. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Jonathan, I can't answer you. Not now." He swallowed hard, his chest aching. "I know. It's not that I don't." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's that my world is falling apart." "Ethan, almost," her voice cracked. "I can't think about forever when I don't even know if he'll see tomorrow." Jonathan closed the box gently, slipping it back into his pocket. He reached for her hand instead, holding it with quiet strength. Then, "Don't answer now. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes searched his face, torn between disbelief and fragile hope. And for the first time since this strange arrangement began, she let herself lean into him, not as an employer, not as a fiancé under contract, but as a man who stood beside her when the world threatened to collapse. The alarms had faded, the corridor quiet again, but their echoes lingered. For Jonathan, the sound was a reminder love and life were never guaranteed. And for Clara, it was a cruel truth just when her heart yearned to say yes. Fate had demanded her silence. The hours after the code blue felt like a blur. Ethan's crisis had passed, but not without consequence. The doctors explained in careful tones the surgery was successful, his breathing stabilized, but his recovery would be long, uncertain. For now, he was alive, and alive was enough. Clara stayed at his bedside until her body simply refused to go on. By the time the clock struck 2 in the morning, she had slumped into the vinyl chair, her head pillowed on her arms beside the bed. Strands of hair fell loose across her face, her breathing uneven with exhaustion. Jonathan stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her. The hospital light was unkind, accentuating the shadows under her eyes. The tension still etched into her brow even into sleep. And yet, To him, she looked extraordinary, strong, human, real. He crossed the room quietly, setting a paper cup of coffee on the table. He hadn't slept either. His tie hung loose around his neck, his jacket draped over a chair. For once, he didn't care about appearances. He only cared about staying. Lowering himself into the chair opposite Clara, Jonathan leaned back, his gaze moving between her and Ethan. The young man's face was pale, his right hand swathed in heavy bandages, an IV line snaking from his arm. Machines hummed softly, monitors blinking a rhythm that Jonathan clung to as proof of life. And then came the silence, the kind that only hospitals at night could create, filled with whispers of mortality, of what could have been lost. Jonathan's chest tightened. He thought of his father again, of the night he had sat helpless in a similar chair, the same sterile air, the same relentless beeping, except that night had ended differently. He had walked out of that hospital without the man who had shaped him. He looked at Clara, her face pressed against her folded arms, her body curled in defeat, a woman who had carried burdens no one else saw, a woman who had fought for her brother with a fierceness that humbled him, a woman who still doubted that love from a man like him could be anything but temporary. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His thoughts ran unspoken, but they burned inside him. How do I prove it to you? How do I show you that I'm not my past? That I won't run when life gets hard? That I choose you not because of convenience, not because of pride, but because without you, none of this means anything. He glanced at Ethan, unconscious but steady, and then back at Clara. She stirred slightly, shifting in her sleep, and a faint sound escaped her lips. His name. Jonathan froze. For a man used to contracts and negotiations, to battles won with signatures and strategy, there was no blueprint for this moment. But the sound of his name from her sleeping lips was enough to pierce him deeper than any business failure ever could. He reached across the small space, his hand hovering just above hers on the table. He didn't touch. Not yet. He simply let himself linger, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, as though proximity itself was a kind of vow. Hours slipped by. Nurses came and went. Ethan shifted in his sleep, the monitors steady, and Jonathan remained, a silent sentinel in the dim room. When dawn broke, pale light spilling through the blinds, Clara stirred awake. She blinked, disoriented, before realizing Jonathan was still there, his posture rigid in the chair, dark circles under his eyes betraying the sleepless night. "You stayed," she whispered. Jonathan's lips curved faintly. "I told you I would." Her gaze softened, but then the old doubts crept back, visible in the hesitation that clouded her eyes. "Jonathan, last night, when you asked me to marry you, I wanted to say yes. God, I wanted to. But this," she gestured weakly toward Ethan's bed, toward the reality of her world. "This is who I am. This is where I come from. And love doesn't erase the distance between us." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life building a bridge across that distance, brick by brick, if I have to. Whatever it takes." Her throat tightened, emotion flickering across her face. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," he admitted. "It's the hardest thing I've ever chosen. But, for the first time, Clara, it's a choice I want to make. Not because of my grandmother, not because of appearances, but because when I see you, I see the life I want." Clara shook her head, torn. "And what about your world? The boardrooms, the headlines, the empire you've built. You can't just walk away from all of it." "Then I'll bring you into it," Jonathan said softly. "Or I'll learn to live in yours. But what I won't do, what I can't do, is let fear of class or money be the thing that keeps us apart." Clara's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him. Part of her did. But another part whispered that this was a dream too fragile to survive daylight. She looked away, her gaze resting on Ethan, and her voice was barely audible. prove it. Jonathan. Not with money, not with speeches, with time, with consistency. That's the only way I'll ever believe. Jonathan sat back, her words carving themselves into him. Then I will. The vow was simple, but it rang with a weight greater than any contract he had ever signed. And as the morning light filled the room, Clara turned her face toward her brother, hiding the tears that slipped free. Jonathan didn't press her further. He only stayed, steady and silent, a man who had finally found the one thing worth losing everything for. By the time morning broke fully over Boston, the hospital was surrounded. Satellite vans lined the street, camera crews jostled against one another, and reporters shouted questions at every passing nurse. News of Margaret Whitmore's revelation had already exploded across television, radio, and social media. Inside the hospital, administrators begged Jonathan to leave by a side entrance. "The press won't stop until you make a statement," one said nervously. "They're disrupting patient care. You need to diffuse this." Jonathan looked at Clara, who sat by Ethan's bed, pale but composed. She didn't answer right away. He could see the fear flickering in her eyes, the dread of being paraded in front of microphones, of being dissected by strangers. But then she took a steadying breath. "If we run now, it'll only look worse. They'll write their own story." Jonathan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we tell them ours." Moments later, they walked together into the makeshift press room, hastily set up in the hospital's conference center. The room erupted at their entrance shouts, questions, flashes of light as dozens of cameras fired. Jonathan guided Clara to the podium. He straightened his shoulders, every inch the commanding businessman the public knew, but this time, without armor. His voice carried across the room, firm but stripped of pretense. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've heard rumors, and I will not insult you by denying them. Yes, Clara Benson and I entered into an agreement 11 months ago. A contract. I asked her to pose as my fiancée to satisfy the terms of my grandmother's will. The room exploded with noise. Reporters shouted over one another. How much did you pay her? Was it fraud? Did you deceive the board?" Jonathan held up his hand, and silence fell by degrees. His next words rang with quiet conviction. "It began as a contract. But that is not what it is anymore. Somewhere in the middle of this arrangement, I fell in love with her. Not with the role she played, not with the image, but with the woman herself. And if that costs me my fortune, then so be it, because I will not apologize for loving her." He stepped back slightly, glancing at Clara. For a moment, she looked frozen, caught between fear and the gravity of his words. But then she moved forward, her voice soft but steady as she leaned into the microphone. "When I took this job," Clara said, "I thought I knew who Jonathan Hale was. The newspapers painted him as ruthless, cold, untouchable, and for months, he lived up to that reputation. He was demanding, arrogant, infuriating." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the room. Jonathan winced, but Clara pressed on. "But then there were the small things. The way he'd straighten my chair before I sat down at an event. The way he remembered my coffee order when I was too tired to speak. The way his expression would tighten when someone else treated me badly, even if he'd been harsh with me himself. Those glimpses showed me the truth. Beneath the armor, there was a man who cared more deeply than he dared to admit." She paused, her eyes glistening as they found his. "And last night, when my brother's life was hanging by a thread, he stayed. Not because a contract required it, not because it looked good, but because he refused to leave me alone in the dark. That is the man I fell in love with." The room was silent now. Even the clicking of cameras had stilled. Then came the inevitable questions. "Miss Benson, how can you expect us to believe this isn't still an arrangement? Mr. Hale, what about your company's reputation? Do you think the public can forgive being deceived?" Jonathan leaned forward once more. His voice was calm, resolute. "You don't have to believe us today. You don't even have to forgive us. Time will tell our story better than we ever could. All I know is that when I look at Clara, I see my future, and I would rather face your doubts with her at my side than live another day pretending to be a man without love. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some reporters exchanged skeptical looks, already drafting headlines that spoke of scandal and deceit. Others nodded thoughtfully, their pens moving more slowly, as if considering the possibility of redemption. Across television screens, reactions mirrored the split. Morning anchors debated whether the love story was genuine or a clever public relations move. On social media, hashtags trended, "War contract love," "Yar Hale truth," Clara and Jonathan. Some mocked, some defended. A surprising number, moved by Clara's trembling honesty, expressed cautious support. But inside the press room, none of that mattered. Clara and Jonathan stood together, fingers entwined under the podium, facing the storm as one. For the first time, the truth, messy, imperfect, vulnerable, was theirs to claim. And though the world outside remained uncertain, Jonathan felt something inside him settle, solid and unshakable. He had chosen love in the harshest of lights. And Clara, standing beside him, realized she had too. The storm of headlines eventually ebbed, though it left scars. For weeks, Jonathan's name lingered on front pages, debated in boardrooms, picked apart in op-eds. Some praised his candor, others called it reckless. Investors muttered about stability. Margaret Whitmore, bitter from her defeat, continued to stir gossip. But Jonathan no longer measured his life by headlines. His days began not with the financial pages, but with visits to Ethan's hospital room. He carried coffee for Clara, crossword puzzles for Ethan, and a steady presence that surprised even himself. One night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Clara found Jonathan asleep, too slumped in the visitor's chair, his head tilted awkwardly, his suit jacket draped over her shoulders. She had stared at him for a long time, her heart caught in a place between disbelief and tenderness. Still, doubts lingered. Words were one thing, promises were easy, but Clara needed proof that he could live in her world, not just drag her into his. Jonathan seemed to understand without her saying it. The first sign came quietly. His penthouse, gleaming, sterile, perched high above Boston's skyline, was sold. When Clara asked why, he shrugged lightly. It never felt like home, just walls filled with expensive things. The second came when he began showing up in places that had nothing to do with his empire. The corner diner Clara used to frequent before work, the farmer's market near the hospital. He would walk beside her, carrying bags of produce, content to let the world shrink to something simple. One Saturday, he showed up at Ethan's hospital room, not in a tailored suit, but in jeans and a worn flannel shirt. Clara had blinked, startled. "You own jeans," Jonathan had chuckled, tugging at the collar. "Turns out I do. They were just buried under Italian silk." Ethan grinned, weak but amused. "You look almost normal." "Hale?" Jonathan grinned back. "Don't get used to it." But Clara saw the flicker of something softer in his eyes, like a man learning to breathe in a world that wasn't built on marble floors and glass towers. The third sign came in the form of a house. It was Clara who found it first, though she hadn't meant to. On one of her long walks meant to clear her head, she'd stumbled across a for sale sign in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. The house was small, white with blue shutters, its porch sagging slightly, its garden overgrown, yet there was something about it, a warmth in its bones, a sense of possibility. When she mentioned it in passing, Jonathan surprised her. He went to see it the next day, and a week later, he handed her the keys. "Jonathan," she gasped, staring at the chipped paint and crooked fence. "Why this? You could buy a mansion 3 times the size." "That's exactly why," he said softly. "Because this feels like a place to live. Not a stage to perform on, a place where you and Ethan could breathe. Where I could learn how to belong." Her throat tightened. She traced her fingers along the weathered wood of the porch rail. "You're serious?" "I've never been more serious." The first night they spent there wasn't glamorous. The electricity flickered, the plumbing groaned, and they ate pizza from a cardboard box on the floor because there was no furniture yet. But Clara laughed, really laughed for the first time in months, the sound filling the empty rooms with life. Jonathan, watching her from across the room, felt something break open inside him. Here. There were no chandeliers, no boardroom expectations, no contracts, just the two of them, sitting cross-legged on the floor, finding comfort in imperfection. As the weeks passed, Jonathan worked to make the house theirs. He mowed the lawn for the first time in his life, earning a blister on his palm and Clara's amused smile. He learned how to fix a leaking faucet with Ethan coaching from a chair. He even burned a pan attempting pancakes, filling the kitchen with smoke until Clara waved a dish towel and laughed until she cried. And in those moments, Clara began to believe. Yet, belief was fragile. Sometimes, late at night, as Jonathan dozed beside her on the couch, she'd watch him and wonder, could a man who had lived in skyscrapers truly stay content in a house with creaky floors and peeling paint? Could love really bridge a gap that money and pride had dug so deep one evening? As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara finally voiced the fear gnawing at her. Jonathan, what if this doesn't last? What if one day you wake up and remember who you are, and I'm just not enough? Jonathan turned to her, his face lit by the fading light. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Clara, I don't want to forget who I am. I want to become someone new. With you, with Ethan. With this house that leaks when it rains and creaks when the wind blows. Because for the first time, I feel like I'm not performing. I'm just living. Her chest ached with the weight of his words. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away, letting herself lean against him, the warmth of his shoulder grounding her. For the first time, Clara thought maybe, just maybe, the bridge between their worlds was real. Not because love erased differences, but because love built something stronger in the middle. Vermont in October was a painting come alive. The hills rolled out in waves of crimson and gold, maple leaves falling like confetti on the winding country roads. Clara had never seen the state in autumn before. She sat quietly in the back of a borrowed car, her hands folded in her lap, letting the beauty wash over her like a balm. The chapel was small, wooden, tucked at the edge of a meadow. Its steeple pointed toward a sky brushed with the last light of afternoon. White pumpkins lined the steps, their simplicity more fitting than any gilded aisle runner. Music drifted softly through the open doors, a single violin, not an orchestra. Inside, the pews were filled not with Boston's elite, but with a handful of people who mattered. Ethan, pale but smiling, sat proudly in the front row with a sketchbook balanced on his knees. Agnes Hale, regal even in her navy shawl, leaned on her cane, but her eyes shone with rare tenderness. A few close friends of Clara's from her long hours of work and study had made the trip, their joy genuine and unfiltered. There were no cameras, no reporters, just the hush of a sacred space and the smell of old wood warmed by candlelight. Jonathan waited at the altar, his breath shallow, his hands trembling despite the calm expression he tried to wear. He had faced hostile investors, ruthless negotiations, crises that could bankrupt empires, but never had he felt fear like this. Not because he doubted Clara, but because the magnitude of the moment pressed down on him this time. Nothing was written on paper, no clause, no condition, only choice. When the chapel doors opened, Clara entered on Agnes's arm. She wore a simple ivory dress, the fabric soft and unadorned, her hair falling in gentle waves with a single sprig of baby's breath tucked above her ear. She had never looked more beautiful because her beauty was not wrapped in diamonds or couture, but in peace. Jonathan's vision blurred as she walked toward him. He barely heard the minister's words of welcome. All he could see was Clara, her steps steady, her smile quiet and sure. When at last she reached him, Agnes placed Clara's hand in his. "Don't waste it this time," she whispered with a wry smile before settling into her pew. The minister spoke of love, of vows, of promises that outlived contracts and defied circumstances. Then he nodded at Jonathan. Your vows. Jonathan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, but after a moment he set it aside. His voice was rough, unpolished, but utterly sincere. Clara. I spent most of my life believing success was measured in towers of glass and steel. I thought I had everything because I could buy anything. But then I met you, and I realized I was starving for something money couldn't buy. He swallowed, his gaze steady on hers. You taught me that real strength isn't control, it's vulnerability. That real wealth isn't measured in accounts, it's measured in love. And so, I promise you this. No contracts, no conditions, only me, choosing you, every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. She drew a shaky breath and began her vows, her voice soft but unwavering. Jonathan, I never believed in fairy tales. Not for people like me, but then you asked me to pretend, and in pretending, I saw the truth, saw the... Beneath the arrogance, beneath the armor, there was a man who remembered the little things, who stayed when the world was falling apart, who chose love even when it cost him everything. Her voice caught, but she continued, stronger. So I promise you this, I will not see you as the empire or the fortune. I will see you, the man who makes burnt pancakes, who mows a crooked lawn, who loves me without conditions. And I will choose you, every day, even when fear whispers that I shouldn't. The violin swelled softly as Ethan stepped forward with the rings. Jonathan's hand shook slightly as he slid the band onto Clara's finger. No more contracts, he whispered. Only promises, she replied, slipping his ring into place. The minister's voice carried clear and sure. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jonathan cupped her face, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. For a moment, time slowed. He kissed her, gentle at first, then with the quiet certainty of a man who had found the center of his world. The chapel erupted in applause, soft, warm, genuine. Ethan whistled, earning a playful glare from Agnes, who dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, even as her lips curved in satisfaction. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet. As Jonathan and Clara stepped onto the chapel steps, hand in hand, leaves swirled around them like blessings. There was no press conference, no announcement to the world, just a handful of loved ones and the hush of Vermont hills. And for Jonathan Hale and Clara Benson, it was enough, more than enough. For the first time, their love stood unchallenged, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. The first light of dawn spilled gently through the curtains of the little house on the edge of town. Outside, the October air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hale woke not to the hum of elevators in a glass tower, not to the sterile silence of a penthouse, but to something altogether different laughter. He blinked, turning his head on the pillow. The bed beside him was empty, the sheets still warm. From down the hallway came the sound again, Clara's voice, light and free, mingling with Ethan's deeper chuckle. Pots clinked, footsteps shuffled, the ordinary music of a home waking up. Jonathan lay still for a moment, listening, his chest tightening with a fullness that no boardroom victory had ever given him. He remembered every twist of the last year, the arrogance he had worn like armor, the cruelty that had been easier than vulnerability, the test his grandmother had orchestrated, the hospital corridors, the sleepless nights, the proposal interrupted by alarms, and then the vows spoken in that small Vermont chapel, whispered not as contracts, but as promises. He rose quietly, pulling on a sweater, padding barefoot toward the kitchen. The scene waiting for him made him pause in the doorway. Clara stood at the stove, her hair loose over her shoulders, wearing one of his shirts that hung past her knees. She laughed as Ethan teased her about her uneven pancakes, brandishing a spatula in mock indignation. Ethan, propped on a stool with his sketchbook open beside him, was doodling caricatures of the newlyweds. The sunlight caught Clara's face just so, illuminating the joy there, unburdened at last. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. For a moment, he didn't move, afraid the simple perfection of it all might vanish if he stepped closer. Clara turned, catching sight of him in the doorway. Her smile softened, and in that look tender, steady, certain Jonathan saw everything he had spent his life searching for. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he echoed, his voice rough with emotion. Ethan grinned. "Your husband overslept. Clara." "I think he's adjusting to real life," Jonathan chuckled, crossing the room to press a kiss to Clara's temple. "Real life looks a lot better than I imagined." They sat together at the small kitchen table, the pancakes slightly burnt, the coffee strong and too sweet the way Clara liked it. Ethan launched into stories about his dreams for art school, his hands sketching wildly in the air. Clara teased Jonathan about his crooked attempt at fixing the porch step. Jonathan laughed, the sound unguarded, surprised even to his own ears. It was ordinary, imperfect, beautiful. As the meal wound down, Clara reached across the table, her hand sliding into his. No words passed between them, but Jonathan felt the quiet certainty in her touch she believed him now, not because of grand gestures or promises spoken under chandeliers, but because of mornings like this. After breakfast, Ethan retreated to his room, leaving them alone. Jonathan and Clara stepped onto the porch, mugs of coffee warming their hands against the chill. The trees blazed red and orange around them, the world bright with change. Jonathan looked at her, his voice low. "You know, I used to think wealth was measured in numbers, that the more I gained, the more I was worth." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But sitting here, with you and Ethan, I've never felt richer in my life." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath misting in the cold air. "That's because you finally understand what it means to be home." They sat in silence for a long while, watching leaves fall, the quiet broken only by the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of branches. Jonathan thought of his grandmother's words, of the lesson she had set in motion. He smiled faintly, speaking not just to Clara, but to himself, to the memory of the man he had been. "Sometimes the hardest contracts," he murmured, "are not signed on paper, but written in the heart." Clara's fingers tightened around his, her answer simple but certain. "And this one, Jonathan, we keep forever." He kissed her gently, the world narrowing to that one moment. The leaves kept falling, the house creaked with life, and Jonathan Hale, once a man defined by towers and fortunes, finally understood. The last day of the contract had only been the first day of everything that mattered. At its heart, Jonathan and Clara's journey is not simply about romance. It is about learning what truly matters in a world that constantly confuses wealth with worth. Jonathan spent his life chasing numbers on a ledger, believing that success could shield him from loss. Clara, on the other hand, lived each day sacrificing her dreams for family, convinced that love was a luxury she could never afford. Together, they discovered a truth many of us learn too late, that money may open doors, but only love and kindness open hearts. The greatest contracts in life are not the ones signed with ink and sealed by lawyers, but the quiet promises we make to care for one another, especially when it costs us pride, convenience, or comfort. For those of us looking back on long lives filled with both triumphs and regrets, this story reminds us of something simple but profound. The measure of our days is not what we accumulate, but what we give, and who we choose to walk beside us. Because in the end, true wealth is not in the bank, it's in the bonds we nurture, the laughter we share, and the love that remains when everything else fades. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to this story of love, sacrifice, and second chances. If it touched your heart, we'd be grateful if you could support our channel simply by liking this video, sharing it with friends who may need a little inspiration, and subscribing so you won't miss the next story we share. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can keep bringing stories that shine a light on what truly matters in life.